major issue that I spoke to you about last time was suffering abandonment. Was the extreme resistance, reluctance of people, all of us, to suffer loss of an object, suffer abandonment by that object, however it's experienced. Now, one of the ways that that whole experience of abandonment is sidestepped, defended against, is through creating a delusional positive mother, so to speak. And one of the major devices in which that is created is through manic defense, which is to say, one exhibits a great deal of joy, happiness, pseudo-joy, pseudo-happiness, an up feeling, tremendous activity, interest, energy, all rather scattered, all somewhat without depth, a lot of doing, all to avoid the death, the depression, and abandonment. Now the question is how to transform that situation clinically. Well, from an object relations point of view, that is done through interpretation. One interprets to the patient that they are creating this false space, this place of seeming good feeling, and even though the analyst is thoroughly aware and explains to the patient that they know that a great deal of rage is around and a great deal of resistance is around in daring to tamper with this so-called good space because of the threat that underlies it, the threat of being thrown into a horrible, abandoning place. Still, one attempts to present to the patient that they are acting delusionally. They are constructing their object world in a delusional way, especially their relation to the therapist. And in this way, attempt to get them to see how that is a defense against this major fear of abandonment. If in turn the patient then can suffer this abandonment issue, what eventually happens is a more and more of a reality-oriented ego develops, in which objects are whole. Now, there is, however, a very different way to deal with the manic defense. And that is very different in the sense that it's not reductive. The Freudian object relation psychoanalytic point of view employs a reductive model. It explains and understands that this manic space, the delusional positive object, is necessary. It doesn't criticize, it doesn't judge, it doesn't lay any guilt on the patient for being in such a place, but it basically dismantles it. Basically, the object is to see that it is a delusional creation and it is basically not helpful. Whether that space is created through eating disorders, whether one creates that space through food, whether it's a bulimic disorder, whether it's an anorectic disorder, if one creates that space through alcohol, if one creates that space through gambling, if you create it through drugs, create it through sadomasochistic sexual acting out. However one may choose to create that space, it has to be dismantled and carefully dealt with. Limit setting is important. For example, if patients are abusing drugs or alcohol, it often becomes extremely important to set limits, to stop that, to insist that the behavior be controlled. This is a so-called approach introduced by Kernberg that brings in so-called parameters into the analytic method, such as limit setting. The underlying reason being that if the patient's ego cannot tolerate that, then the process of psychotherapy is unlikely to be useful at all. So you do find this, by the way, and it's extremely subtle when you work with patients. They will talk to you about having a few drinks before they go to bed. And they will talk about, maybe getting drunk every now and then. It's very common among analysts, I find, to undervalue the seriousness of that condition. Very commonly, analysts will reply, will delusionally collude with patients in that situation and say, oh, we all have a few drinks occasionally, or we all tend to get drunk occasionally. Where in fact what's often going on is a serious abuse. It takes an alcoholic to know an alcoholic. Very clever ways of deception and hiding go on. And in this situation, we're dealing not simply with alcoholics. Perhaps one could argue from here to doomsday on what's an alcoholic and what isn't, but you're certainly dealing with behavioral kinds of modalities that are that basic goal of which is to create a delusional kind of good feeling. That's to say, that can happen through, for example, the release of fantasy. There are people who have no fantasy life until they have a few drinks. They have absolutely no kind of sense of anything exceptional in their fantasy life, or in their or without their few ounces of bourbon, they have very spiritual fantasy life. But as soon as, or none, but as soon as they have a couple of ounces of bourbon, suddenly they are Queen Elizabeth. And it is very strong. And you see, you have these internal pockets of tremendous suppressed fantasy in people. This is especially true in the so-called schizoid personality. It's also true in the borderline personality. There is an enormous amount of unconscious inflation that rarely ever comes to the surface. Yet, it's triggered, for example, with alcohol. So, unless you restrict that and work towards restricting it, what happens is a permanent splitting sets in between one part of life that's lived in fantasy and the other part that never touches it. And consequently, kind of a delusional space is created. Now, another subtle way that substances are abused is that they wind up severely limiting the creative output of the person. Now, in powerful creative personalities, this doesn't hold. The person will create no matter what. Jackson Pollock would paint whether he's drunk or not. But he did some of his most serious painting when he was sober. However, what often happens is that a person's work capacity is severely cut down by the fact that the guy will come home and he'll have his Irish whiskey here and he'll have a few other drinks there, and before you know it, he's operating kind of okay, but if you get him to stop drinking, lo and behold, he's producing 4 times what he did before. So it often has this subtle way of a masochistic suffering and creating a place that feels good out of extreme limitation, extreme kind of lowering of one's capacities, and in the process getting something that might feel terrible, but it's very, very safe because it's extremely predictable. You understand that? We create spaces that are horrible in a sense, but they are also extremely safe because they're predictable and nobody can take them away. So it's very important to have some kind of objective awareness of what the person is doing and what they're not doing. But aside from that, to turn a little back towards manic defense, it's here that the analyst's capacity to be embodied can be crucial. If the analyst is able to know what it means to be in their body, if those of you here, some of you should know what it means, what the phrase being in the body connotes, and others probably might wonder what in the world that's about. Well, we're talking about the felt condition of living a feeling state in which we are within the boundaries of our own bodies, and in which we feel our life so constrained, in which we feel our size, age. Age is very important. If you're not in your body, you don't know your age. If you're not really feeling the exact confines and sense of your body, you're any age. You're also very ununique as an individual. Jung says that it's only an embodied self that's a unique self. If a person is not in their body and does not feel their own spirit in the body, I'll say more about that, then the very nature of the self that they are and the ego that they are is not unique at all. There is no difference, substantially, between thousands of people whose main connection is a spirit connection out of the body. There's very little substantial difference, except for quirks, perhaps, between people whose main connection to anything other than their own egos is experienced without reference to body. Body is the great limiter, and body is what brings uniqueness. That is to say, once again, if someone is not embodied, that person is basically connecting to universals. And they are being defined by universals. And to one degree or another, their own uniqueness does not exist. This special quality of a unique soul with its own journey, with its own development, with its own suffering, with its own story, doesn't exist and isn't felt without a body. One's instead always a new creation. When there is an embodiment of soul, ideas such as reincarnation start to get a real meaning to one. They start to have a strange fascination and meaningfulness, which is why I think one of the reasons that in the underworld mysteries that have to do with redemption of Persephone, who was called uniqueness. It's only when Persephone rejoins with Demeter that there again is uniqueness. Sometimes I think that one of the reasons Demeter withdrew from the Olympians when Persephone was lost to her is because she lost her uniqueness. Pardon me? Uniqueness? That's nicely said by Karenyi in Essays on Science and Mythology. Now, that state of uniqueness and that state of an embodied, that's gained with an embodied awareness, that's a crucial ontology, that's a crucial way of being that is extremely functional and necessary when dealing with someone in manic defense. Because someone in a manic defense is the exact opposite of that. There's nothing they want less than to get near the core of their own being, which is filled with depression. So instead, this is, if you ask someone in a manic defense, who are you? They'll tell you what they're doing. In other words, they're a function. They're not a being. They're not someone who would normally react to a question like that with absurdity. What a ridiculous question. How can anyone answer, who are you? But someone in manic defense will always answer with what they're doing. Now, if you are able to be embodied in a kind of, with this sense of this is not a state that has to do with an ego feeling its body, but it's a state that has to do with having had some serious spiritual connection that has descended. So that being in body is an experience of the life of the body. It's an experience in which body has its own awareness, its own consciousness, in which when you're in body, you sense a lot of what's happening outside of you. And in that way, you especially are sensitive to manic defense in a person. Yeah. No, dancers are notoriously out of their bodies. No, see, the dancers have a very poor body relationship generally. They're using their bodies as objects. To be in the body is something that's very different. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was going to comment. When we do so much of what we call body work, unless the numinous quality of spirit is...
Exactly. That's why people who do bioenergetics complain always, how come they got to keep doing the exercises? No transformation. It becomes a kind of anal mechanism of sort of shitting out the disorder temporarily, and then it comes back, you see. But there's no transformation because there's no spirit. And it's all the difference in the world how one approaches body. If you approach body as something that you simply think of as a storehouse of affects, that through appropriate manipulation, breathing, can be released, that's one thing. And that's not so bad. Body is really the unconscious, in one sense, the place that a terrific amount of affect is stored away and hidden under by armoring. Hence, the Gestaltists made a nice translation of Freudian resistance into body armor and dealt on the level of armoring as a means of repression to hold down all of this affective content that previous Freudian work attempted to deal with strictly from a mental point of view, through associations, etc., and bringing back repressed contents. Gestaltists, learning from Reich, instead recognized all the armoring that was used to block, contain these heavy affects, and so worked directly from a Reichian model to break down body armor. Now, this is an extremely substantial endeavor and very, very important. There are many people for whom, if they do not work to break down their body armor, work very much in this context, they will never discover their dark emotions. They will never discover their sadism. They will never discover the depths of their cruelty. They'll never really discover what Jung means by the shadow. They'll never discover the drive qualities within them to destroy, the psychopathic qualities that live in all of us. Never, without breaking down the body armor. But that's very different from the kind of relationship to body that Jung is talking about, for example, in his seminars on Nietzsche's Zarathustra. Sometimes when you hear about Jung, one thinks that he had no concern for body. If you read his 1928 essay on psychic energy, Jung says the psyche is essentially a relatively closed system, meaning the physiological qualities of body need not be included in dealing with psyche. And generally, as you look throughout Jung, everything is dealt with largely, with a bias towards spirit, image, the psychic component. For example, when the symbolism of descent appears in dreams, especially, for example, as Jung deals with it in his Psychology of the Transference, it's taken not to mean body, but to mean that stage in which what one has learned about oneself needs to be taken into ethical reality and conduct. Or it's taken to mean that stage in which intuitions cease to be only intuitions but become lived realities through the sensation function. But it's not taken to mean the embodiment, the incarnation of this experience so that it also lives in body. When Jung comes to dealing with Nietzsche, he has to deal with body, because for Nietzsche, the self was also the body. In fact, in certain places, Nietzsche identifies the self with the body, which Jung aptly says that's an inflation of the body. You see. And so, when Nietzsche is talking about God is dead, he's talking about the Christian spiritual God. That's without body. Now, in dealing with Nietzsche, if you read those seminars, which are difficult to get hold of, but they exist, they're privately circulated, they're in some libraries, you will see a man who knew about body to an incredible degree, and just didn't write about it much in the collected works because, he says, it's too hard to write about. Now, you see, if you're going to deal with body the way a bioenergeticist or Rathian might, it's not very hard to deal about. One can easily talk about different body types, body armoring, etc. But Jung says when you begin talking about body, you have to start talking about what's known in occult tradition as the subtle body. You have to start talking about what in China is called Kui soul. You have to start the Kui soul, Kwei, it's the usual English transliteration. You have to start talking about domains of experience that are not causal. You see, Jung says that if you are in the body, in the specific way he's trying to explain, the way that Nietzsche means, the way I'm trying to talk about, in the body in which there has been a spiritual revelation and there has been a descent, then you experience the unconscious in the body. You don't hear this usually when you read Jung collected works. In fact, he says things that knock you a little bit off your chair if you are somewhat Jungian scholars and care about what he reads. What you read, he says things such as the unconscious is in the body. Now, he also cautions you to not misunderstand what he means when his more common premise is the unconscious is everywhere. But he says that it's only in the body that we experience the workings of the unconscious, to the extent that one can experience a sympathy with all living things. In other words, an empathy, that extends to all living things and is in no way that we could possibly legitimately conceive understood causally. So one is dealing basically with nothing less than a causal phenomenon that perhaps fall under an extended notion of synchronicity, but something very, very hard to explain and understand in a scientific manner. Yeah?
Could you say what you think psychoid means in this context?
Yeah. When Jung talks about the psychoid, he's talking about that domain in which consciousness vanishes. Our consciousness swings along the spectrum from letting it, you might say, sink down into body, in which we can have this awareness of our own body processes, and through the somatic unconscious, subtle body, we can have awarenesses of the processes in other people, in animals. Primitives would certainly say in stars even, of the Bushmen. You can have awareness of processes in other people, in animals, and primitives who solely function under this kind of consciousness believe they can hear the stars talk. Bushmen do.
You get that in LSD, you experience the consciousness of an animal.
Of course. But of course you do, yes. But as you continue to move in that direction, you reach a point where your awareness fades out. I mean, you reach a limit of awareness. That limit is what's symbolically represented by a snake. Snake symbolism is important because no one can communicate with a snake. You reach a point as you get more and more cold-blooded vertebrates, as you start to get into the levels of the animal kingdom that are more and more cold-blooded, you get to that level of objects that it's more and more difficult to have any kind of empathetic connection with. And that defines a boundary Jung called psychoid. That's to say, that place beyond which it is impossible to have a psychic connection. And the same thing exists relative to your consciousness as it swings away from body towards a pure spiritual consciousness. You also can have higher and higher degrees of spiritual awareness, but you continue to go higher and you cannot go any higher. Consequently, in Kabbalistic doctrine, ascent mysticism, in the ascent, for some of you who know a little about Kabbalah, you might know that very commonly when Kabbalists ascend up the tree of life, they ascend through the Sephiroth and maybe get to the second Sephiroth in the supernal triad, the Sephiroth of Binah, maybe a bit of Chachma, but they never get up to Kether, and they never get up to the Ein Sof and Ein Sof or in higher levels. There's a bounding of consciousness, awareness on the ascent level and on the descent level. And these boundaries are what Jung called the psychoid levels. Now, within the psychoid itself, there is, of course, a tremendous amount of process that goes on.
You mean that the psychoid is outside those boundaries?
Yeah.
And it has some mysterious relation to the physical?
Sure, of course it does. I mean, it is the level in which as Jung would say, the archetypes function. And it has a level, it has this, one can approach the functionings that go on within the psychoid level. One can get close to them through entering body, and equally through entering spirit, like in an LSD experience or something, or in a mystical ascent experience. One gets near these processes of order, okay, that are normally not felt in everyday consciousness, and that really have, as one gets deeper and deeper, In either one of these levels, one gets to the mysterious place in which matter and psyche are the same. And that's the place that Jung called the archetype of the unus mundus, the one reality, in which matter and psyche are the same. Just two different ways of experiencing the same unitary reality.
That's the psychoid realm.
Yes.
And that's where the archetypes are in quotes.
Exactly. That's where the archetypes are in quotes, right. As we enter space-time awareness, as our consciousness descends and attempts to live in space and time, that unitary reality is not perceptible. And instead, it splits into opposites called matter and psyche, each of which then become domains in which we can enter the so-called psychoid realm as well. Yeah.
So, are you leading up to or implying, or may I infer, that in that stage, postnatal stage, before time becomes a category of experience, that the infant is in this numinous psychoid space where unitary reality is the experience?
I think not.
You think not? Okay.
I think not. I think that there is a closeness. I think there's an affinity with it. I think it's a space that's better understood in Neumann's terminology of the Ouroboros, that early stage of maternal Ouroboros. But I think this archetypal quality that Jung talks about as the unus mundus is rather a level of transcendent reality that I think is something that is not necessarily experienced, as far as I can imagine, in the first month of life. So I don't think the child experiences all the archetypes, as some people do think, and that everything can be related back to infant experience. I don't believe it is. I think it's much more likely that these are categories that require a different mode of experience, such as mystical ascent, such as transcendence, or such as inference, because we infer the existence of this unitary reality from the fact that we have in our domain of experience synchronistic events. You see, synchronistic events are events that transcend limitations of time and space. These are events in which an outer physical reality has a correspondence with an inner psychic image. You dream, perhaps, that someone dies, and you find out the next day that exactly at the time you had that dream, that person died. A whole slew of such experiences often exist to one degree or another in people's lives. Now, often the closer someone is to the unconscious, the more they have experiences like that. A person who is going into a schizophrenic state will often have a great number of synchronicities. Equally, someone who's in a very creative state can often have a lot of synchronistic experiences. Because we postulate the existence of a domain in which time and space are basically suspended, in which matter and psyche are basically identical. And out of that domain falls events into time, which we see as synchronicities. Okay? Now, the fact of incausal connectedness, that's to say the relationship of events, say from one person to another, that exist when one is in the body in this manner in which spirit has descended into body. That's a condition that's not easy to put into scientific framework, causal reductive framework. Jung was writing about this in 1935, 36, 37, 38, 39, when he was writing the Zarathustra seminars. That was 15 to 20 years before he wrote his paper on synchronicity. He waited until he was in his 70s, because late 70s, he felt that otherwise people would just feel he was crazy to talk about such a thing as synchronistic phenomena and take it seriously. Now, that's why, he says, in his collected works, he doesn't deal much with body because it's too hard. But his psychology is a psychology, I think, that is the best psychology we have as a way to body because of its respect for the spirit and the archetypal level. Jung says if you get someone who is in their body and they don't know what spirit is, preach good old-fashioned Christianity to them. Get them out of their bodies. You see? There's the awareness of having a body, a real solid body experience, an awareness of one's body, what it can do, what it can't do, which is very different from being in the body and experiencing the unconscious in that way. Now, what does that mean, say, in the concrete instance of dealing with a manic defense? Well, if you are rooted in body in this way, operating through the somatic unconscious, you will have clear indications when a manic defense is going on in somebody. You'll have indications that are not so clear if you're not in body. Because when you're in your body, you are basically creating or allowing to exist a kind of field of participation mystique. You see, you're almost creating a state of symbiotic merger through the effect of the unconscious. And in that condition, you'll find how your own energies are tending to go up, how your own energies are tending to subtly flee a little, move around, not focus, shift away from hard issues, not deal with things that seem difficult, little bits of anger you feel in the patient, little bits of depression, how you're tending to go towards a little bit of storytelling. You'll get a lot of affective, cognitive experience that you don't get so much if you're not in your body in this way. Now, for example, when someone is in a manic defense, it's often hard to, it's not that it's very easy to detect all the time. It's not that common that, the patient sits down and tells something has a sadness in them and you feel like laughing. It's not that common that someone is comes in and is just jumping all over the place and can't stop laughing. Or you can just, it's just impossible to not feel a sense of laughter that wants to just bubble up. And that's on the extreme end of manic defense. What generally happens is that if you can't pick it up, and I think working on the somatic unconscious is a good way of picking it up. I'm sure there are others, I don't know what they are, but everybody works in their own way. But I think that, for example, Winnicott says that one way that he knows manic defense exists is if he sits with somebody for an hour, or whatever he does, and can't make heads or tails out of what's going on. Thinks maybe it's this, maybe it's that, all this is happening, and just can't understand what's happening. And then when the person leaves, soon after it all becomes clear. No, I think that to one degree or another, we have similar experiences, to one degree or another. The patient leaves and it becomes clear what the hell was going on. But, because the manic defense that's going on underneath all the time is really so chaotic that it is disturbing perception, that it is disturbing the ability to make any order. If, however, one is rooted in the somatic unconscious, it is much easier to pick up the subtleties, the movements, the disturbances of manic defense. Is everyone with me so far? Okay. Now, if you relate to a patient who's in a manic defense, who's using manic defense, and that means all your patients. We all use manic defense to one degree or another. But if you relate to a patient out of the somatic unconscious, just doing that, just being that way has an effect. That means if you are operating in that manner and out of that ontology, you point out to the person here, it feels like you're really scattering all over the place. You feel pretty, not able to just stay with one thing. I feel you're sidestepping something now. But you say that out of the space of being in the somatic unconscious, that can have quite a serious transformative effect on the manic defense. Yeah.
I have clients that is very manic like this, usually hours, and I haven't understood why, but I have noticed in why my response. My response has been that I find myself breathing very shallowly.
You got it.
And very,
sure.
I can't hardly breathe.
Right.
And so my response has been to start taking deep breaths, and that's about the only way I can stay with her is to consciously breathe deeply. It sounds like
Yeah.
The quality that I experience is I take a breath and I sink into myself. Yeah, and that, when I feel all this gunk out here, and then I sink. And that's the only way. I've never tried to tell anybody what that's like because there aren't any words for it, really. But it's kind of a sinking down inside myself, and I just go there. Stay there.
that's the same thing that that's exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
I would have I do have a concern about this in terms of the training, because I think word is when you say the analyst or the therapist is rooted in somatic unconsciousness, and so many therapists themselves are leery of any somatic perceptions or sensations, so that I know many training programs that simply do not include this. I'm not speaking to this particular union one, but my concern would be the training level, that it's somehow built into the training, but it isn't.
Well, sure. I think there is. It's not built into any training, and I think it needs to be.
How can one further one's own embodiment practice?
Well, one can further it by learning how to breathe. The best model of breathing comes from the Rakians. They learned how to breathe all over again. They used to go to the zoo and watch cats breathe, watch the big animals breathe.
What about meditation?
Meditation is fine if it's a meditation that is embodied. If it's a meditation that's an ascent meditation, it's no good at all.
I mean, if you use a mantra,
Those are all spiritual techniques, upward moving techniques.
So
what
that's,
kind?
Tai Chi moves down.
Pardon me?
Tai Chi.
Tai Chi moves down, Zen moves down.
Okay, Zen moves down.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I've experienced lately is that it's called Shambhala meditation, but at any rate, it's concentrated on the breath and staying.
Right, it's a Buddhist meditation, exactly. It moves down, yeah.
There certainly are, though, movements toward this in training that I have experienced, that this need in training programs that I hear voiced very audibly towards the combination, not a eclectic mishmash, but really integrating the body and the spiritual.
Well,
So it's kind of nice to hear about it.
Yeah, I'm not aware of too much activity that way myself. You probably know more than I do about that, but it certainly needs to happen. Yeah. So one can learn how to breathe, and that's not such an easy task. Inappropriate breathing, you should be able to feel the breath as though it is pulled up, coming up from deep down, up from the pelvic area, lower pelvic area, from Muladhara chakra. The idea is to feel the breath come up and go all the way up, and in some techniques kind of bounce off the roof brain, and then come back down. Buddhists call that riding the breath. To be able to have the breath come up and come down, naturally it doesn't do that, but we feel a traveling wave in our body that corresponds to that. Okay? The idea is that on the down, especially on the down breath, one, at the bottom of the breath, one should feel a drop in the pelvic area and the anus opening. What's that? Yeah. And most people are terribly blocked at the waist, or blocked lower down, and that corresponds to a tightened jaw. If the jaw is tense, then the anus is tense.
Then a kundalini technique would start off with that.
Yeah, but go up.
But you would start off with it. You would end up with...
Wants to end up with an ascent experience. Yeah.
That might combine those.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
When you just say on the in-breath, it goes up to your head, on the out-breath, it goes down, is that
Yeah.
what you're saying?
Right. Right. That's right. Yeah.
There's an ancient yogic technique of dealing with vertigo by having the breath come down to your feet.
Oh, sure. Wonderful.
And I do that for meditation.
When you do it yourself. Exactly. Yeah, you take them down. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. If you find people who are, who are in all kinds of agoraphobias and whatnot, don't breathe. Borderlines don't breathe. There's always a severe disorder in the breathing. L. Lowen says that if you can get someone in their body, they're no longer schizophrenic. If you can get someone breathing in their body, they're no longer psychotic. They're in reality. They're grounded in the here and now. But as you say, that's an important point, because if the therapist can do that, can breathe that way, it has a terrific counter effect on the patient. It helps, it induces their breathing too. If you can do it. If their defenses are so terribly strong, often it's very, very, very difficult. But it's a space to try to get into. And if you can get into that space, then the question is what happens. If you are able to be with someone in your body in this mode of opening, especially the anus opening, jaw slack, that's the modality of spontaneity. Because at that place of opening at the bottom, in that time, in fact, one can wait a count of 1, 2, 3 at the bottom. At that place, contents start to come up. Things appear. This is the place of appearance of imagery. Appearance of vision, if you will. This is the kind of vision that existed at Eleusis. The Greek word for it was olympus, flaring up. When adopted the position of Demeter, all the initiates did, male and female alike. There's some naive thinking that likes to think of those mysteries as basically women, that women were initiated into them. It's nonsense. Men and women were initiated, and children in later times, and children. They were all. I'm not sure about earlier times of children were initiated. Are you?
Yeah, I think from Athens, there's like a young adolescent, if I remember right, that became part of all of it.
Oh, was that right? Well, that would probably symbolize an aspect of Dionysus. Was that, as far as you know, there was an adolescent? Is that the function of it?
Yeah.
Would be included. That's interesting. I didn't know that really. But that's in those mysteries in which the initiates took the position of the goddess Demeter. In my way of thinking about it, Demeter is a wonderful image of the somatic unconscious. And so if one roots in Demeter consciousness, one is rooted in a body consciousness that leads to the somatic unconscious. And out of that, vision can flare up. you see. And it's a spectral kind of vision. It's not the vision of clarity that one gets in a spiritual ascent. This is the vision that comes and goes. This is the vision that appears, flutters, is not clear, is hazy, and leaves. When you're with a patient and a manic defense and this kind of vision begins to come up, one sees often a child running away. One kind of sees the person doing all this in front of you, and imaginally you see some very depressed other side just hiding. It's a kind of active imagination that appears that can be shared with the patient. You begin to have perceptions of how old the person looks. You can ask, how old do you feel now? Very commonly, the person will tell you an age. My experience is they often do. And it's an age that you've seen pretty much yourself before. Sometimes you might see a 4-year-old or a 7-year-old. They'll say, I feel 6. And that can be exchanged with the patient. This can be shared imagination. And then what can happen is that part can be, that young age can be focused upon, and in the process it can help separate out this child part from the adult part. We can talk more about that. That gets into the so-called child of joy and the depressed child, but I just wanted to turn into it a little to give a sense of the kind of imagination and seeing that comes up out of this embodied consciousness. Yeah.
The opposition of Demeter.
Yeah. Passive, actively passive. It's an actively passive position in which, for example, with your patient who scatters all over the place, if you were to take the position of Demeter with that patient, get down into your body, feel the breathing of your body, feel, your embodied emotions, what you will feel is depressed. You will feel the depression of Demeter. You will feel depressed because you will feel the loss of soul that this person is acting out through manic defense. You know?
I've often gotten a clue when I finally figured it out in terms of when you say spotting out that they're not breathing, is I find that I'm not breathing.
Sure.
All of a sudden I say,
Sure.
oh, are you aware that you're not breathing because I picked that up?
Sure, all of this gets picked up through operating on the body and out of somatic unconscious, exactly. Yeah. Right, yeah.
I was once sitting with a guy in my face and discovered that he had a constant in the place where I had the pain.
Yes.
Is that what?
Oh, yeah.
I didn't realize what was happening.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. You get all kinds of sympathetic perceptions that way. Often in the same place, sometimes not in the same place. See, a woman's center and a man's center are different. A woman's power center is lower than a man's power center.
Would you say to them, I feel such and such?
At times you can, yeah. It's what a woman's center of power is in her womb. A man's center of power is in the solar plexus. That's why Don Juan has men lie close to a woman's womb with their solar plexus in order to regenerate the woman's power. The way that the two people, say a man and a woman, correlate in terms of their sort of centers of gravity, felt centers of effectiveness, are not exactly isomorphic one-to-one. So sometimes, often, and this is, of course, between men and men too, women and women, the places that one feels perceptions, like you feel something in your head, you feel something stomach, chest, generally whatnot, doesn't necessarily correspond to those exact places of the person, but sometimes it can. You know?
I have a repeated experience of getting a sharp pain right here when I'm working with people. And whenever I do, I'm never sure what it means, except it means something is wrong.
Well, often there's a lot of belief that often pains exactly in the forehead, between the eyes, are symptomatic of schizoid splitting. Which is, and the flip side of that is all of the saints you find have, in medieval art, have large bumps between their eyes.
What is it, third eye?
It's a third eye, so these pains are often all important, but for me the place to reference always is to come back to body. Now the question is, you see, what happens by virtue of being in the body? I will like us to take a little break now, and we'll come back and I'll tell you some clinical material which shows from the viewpoint of the unconscious how a manic defense is transformed as a function of the analyst's body consciousness. So let's go on with transforming the manic defense as an example of the delusionally positive mother. I worked with a woman who had this kind of strong defense. It's interesting, there's a woman who did many, many years of body work and found that in being with me being embodied in this way, that she got into body that way more than years of bioenergetics techniques. And I think this is not me. I think this is the power of the somatic unconscious, and I think that one gets led into body this way often in a much deeper and much more transformative way than through a lot of exercising that tries to ground one, etc., as important as that is. Now, this woman, after I was with her this way for a few times, had the following dream. She dreamt that there was a man who also vaguely at one time in a dream looked like a serpent, and he was on a cross. And another man came and took a knife and went with the knife and cut his jugular vein so that the blood came down and went into the earth. Now, the associations were that I was the man with the knife who cut his throat. Symbolically, the serpent on the cross, in alchemy, for example, is the motif of fixing, Mercurius, is the motif of holding, centering, keeping still the unconscious in its aspect of flying away into parts, what the alchemists call fixing. Now, that in clinical terminology, one way the volatile, in distinction to the fixed mercury, manifests in clinical phenomenology is manic defense. It's an example of the volatile mercury that's always escaping. Now, what's especially interesting to me in this is the way her unconscious saw the analytical process, stemming from these her perceptions of my embodiment. And this is a woman who's a therapist of many, many years' experience, so this kind of language could pass between us easily without itself being defensive. Terrible. The little part of it was always defensive. But in any case, what happens, you see, is that there's a kind of logos, a knife, that comes out of this body consciousness. That's the logos, for example, that will say, where'd you go? You know, I hear what you're saying, but something else seems to be going on. You seem happy, but yet what I feel is a lot of depression, etc., etc. However you may communicate out of your somatic unconscious consciousness. The thing that's crucial is that in transforming the manic defense in this manner, the blood, the spirit in it, moves down into the earth, into body. You see? Spiritualized matter, materialized spirit, say the alchemists. This would be a transformation process in which the spirit energy caught up in the manic defense returns to body for her, descends to body and enlivens body. That is why working in this manner can lead to transformation of the manic defense and a regeneration of body and body consciousness. Whereas working in a psychoanalytic object relations manner results in taking energy out of delusional spaces that one's created and aligning it with more reality-oriented ego functioning, and also taking some of the energy one has won through consciousness and suffering and using it to repress delusional escapes. But that's the psychoanalytic way of development towards more realistic whole object relations. What I'm saying to you is this mode of operating is one along the model of transformation, not repression. And in the process, one can value not only the defensive, negative nature of the so-called delusional space and the manic defense, but you can see that it is also a defense against archetypal reality and against body. In transforming it in this way, the spirit goes down into body, and what else comes out is that the manic-y energy that was around, which was a pseudo-joy, can move into real felt joy, and also into sexuality. So that what happens out of this so-called delusional space that the Freudians would generally like to throw in the garbage can, what can come out of that is a kind of Dionysian quality, and also what can come out of it is an Earth Mother, Demeter, a revived, revitalized Earth. You follow me? And then if you look to the other side of the polarity, to this negative, attacking feminine image, that becomes, from an archetypal significance, if the person and the therapist can suffer through the abandonment depressions, that becomes the angry, raging Erinyes, dark Demeter. You see, that becomes the dark feminine, not against the ego, against the conscious personality, but in service of it. You see, if one doesn't have access to the dark feminine, doesn't have access to extreme negative emotions, it's impossible to really live on Earth in an embodied way with any vulnerability of your soul, because you're not defended. When Persephone returns from the underworld, she returns with Hecate, mind you. She returns with the witch at her aid. Oh, she comes back with Hecate and Athena. Surely, What are the triple-bodied guys? Mhm. Now, you see, when you look at it from that point of view, you also begin to get a different viewpoint of the extreme negative emotions that the so-called borderline personality exudes. You can have a sense that the hatred, the extreme vehement rage and envious attacks on you as therapist are really, in essence, good. You don't have to be a masochist to do this, you know. You can really know they're good out of your own understanding. And it makes all the difference in the world to be able to interpret to a patient that that rage they feel, that hatred they feel, that thank God it can be there because that's the stuff that can protect them. And that's a very, very difficult thing for a patient to accept because, recall, with that split negative mother image, the patient feels ugly, detestable, awful, dreadful in their body image awful. So when these terribly negative emotions come up out of somebody, you must understand, and it's very difficult to know this, because you just feel under attack, but you must understand that the person feels ugly and the worst person on earth for having these feelings. And if you can align instead with the positive significance of these feelings, you can go a long way towards detoxifying, if you will, towards helping to transform their extreme negative self-image that they have in light of having these feelings.
What does it protect them against?
It protects them against psychic rape. Okay, if they are people who have are able to have these extreme negative emotions, number one, they're going to be taken seriously by other people. And seriousness is a key here, because one of the other transformations that comes of the negative aspect of the feminine archetype here is seriousness. There is often, not always, but there is often a severe lack of seriousness in patients that are split in these opposites, with a lot of manic defense, with a lot of avoidance. There's an extreme lack of seriousness about their life. Seriousness in a healthy way that doesn't take itself so seriously. But a healthy seriousness is absent. And when the person can begin to integrate these dark emotions in a positive way, a new sense of seriousness enters. Now, yeah.
I was going to say that very often in groups or group meetings, I've had the experience, and I know other people have had, that the dark side of women is unleashed, and all this anger is in the room, and very often that's the point at which, instead of dialogue continuing, everything gets sucked down, gets shut down again. And perhaps if all of us as facilitators get in touch with our side of that part and move on. But it's not just in the analytic hour is what I'm suggesting. Even in meetings such as when speakers are there, or whenever, or in women's groups, women's groups, whatever. When the dark mother rage comes out and people are so confounded to find it in themselves and others, very often that's the stopping point.
They are unable to take it into act. This, for
Or see it as
myself
having positive.
and for other women, I see as the great, for women artists in particular, they stop at rage and
Well, you see, one thing in that context, you see, what one's dealing with here is the mystery of transformation of these issues. And that's why the Eleusinian mysteries, for example, are of such great importance. See? Because you take a look at the Homeric hymn to Demeter, which is the hymn which defines the content of the mysteries. Now, we know that Demeter searched for her daughter, Persephone, and was unable to find her until aided by Hecate and Helios. And during this time, she goes through this terrific depression. And she goes and she sits on the what she does is she sits on what's called the laughless rock. Or in other modes, she sits by a well. But she sits by the laughless rock. And after she finds out what happened to Persephone, she withdraws from the gods and she enters Metanera's house, finally, through the aid of the daughters. And there she sits, dressed as a widow, depressed, until the servant girl, Iambe, makes her laugh with obscene gestures. You see? The gestures of Balbo, which incidentally is Demeter's shadow. Now, what that means is that there is a necessity to lighten up. The depression is lightened up through being able to connect to exhibitionism. Now, at this point, in dealing with this level of psyche, you're not dealing with the kind of exhibitionism that manifests in the narcissistic character disorder. That is to say, you're not dealing with an exhibitionism that you can infer exists by virtue of the control on you that it exudes. When the exhibitionistic sector of the narcissistic character is dominant, it is part of that mirror transference phenomenology which makes you shut up and listen. In other words, listen as they exhibit themselves. But in this level, this is much deeper, different. And this is an exhibitionism that's best seen in these obscene gestures that show up in art as Isis with her legs spread, sitting on a pig, exposing her genitals. That's the action that caused Demeter to laugh. That was Balbo's action. And what you find clinically at this stage often is that people will severely hide their joy, their happiness about things they accomplished, for example. They're terrified of being show-offs. They're terrified, of being accused, of just being showing off. So, for example, you will find they'll tell you a story. In the story, they'll come and they'll say, gee, I went into this class, and it was really hard for me. I held back all the time, and I watched what was happening, and I just, at the right moment, I just said one thing. And I didn't want to say any more. That was enough. And they're talking to you, and you feel depressed. Somehow there's an inner depression that's transferred. Something's not right. Somehow I'm feeling their abandonment expectation, if they dare, showed their exhibitionism. And sitting with that kind of transference reaction of depression and using it as a guide, lo and behold, it appears that they didn't just say a little thing in that class. They spoke up more than they ever did in their life. And they were full of joy about the effect it had. It had the first decent effect in changing the terrible attitudes of that instructor and the whole class. But unless it is picked out and the persons see exhibitionism seen, and furthermore, until their sexual exhibitionism can come out, which can take the form of near involuntary body movements that are extremely sexual in content. As the body is regenerated, it tends to have an autonomy, which can be extremely embarrassing to people. You see. But all of this is part of the lightening of the depression. You see?
What form would that take?
What form would what take? It would take the form. It would take the form. It can take the form of the person actually moving in the chair in a way that is almost explicit sexual, movements corresponding to intercourse. It could be that explicit. At least such is my experience. And to a lesser degree, just feeling sexual. Daring to let that sexual energy come out and affect you. To show it, in other words. In other words, the level of exhibitionism here is a level that has a strong erotic quality in distinction to the exhibitionism that's dominant on the level of the narcissistic character disorder, which has more to do with power. The quality of exhibitionism that shows here has much more to do with instinctual processes and sexuality and joy and laughter than does the exhibitionism that is linked in the narcissistic character disorder, which has more to do with shut up and listen, look at me, in other words, showing one's effectiveness, one's power, so that one can own it.
Just come back a second. When you said their rage protects them against psychic rape, do you mean that the rape is them not being taken seriously?
The rape can be them not taking seriously. The rape can be withdrawal of a spouse, for example. Very commonly the situation is, a woman achieves something and the man withdraws when that happens.
But if she gets into a rage, then he'll pay attention.
Damn right. Yeah. Or else leave, but some honesty will come out of it. The rage and the extreme negative emotion is the absolute necessary condition for psychic life and spirit to embody. In the Eleusinian Mysteries, the cry went out, Brimo is born from Brimos. Brimo is the divine child, Dionysus. Brimos represents raging emotions, emotions that rouse terror and fear. Brimo means to snort and arouse terror. That is to say that Brimo is the dark, negative side of Demeter also. So it is in a sense from the dark emotion and the ability to tolerate and have it that something new is born. And without that, one can have an endless series of images, experiences, and nothing happens. Nothing new really happens. To speak of, for example, you have to have all the other difficulties, one clings with transferences, etc. But unless there is the darkness. Now that is in classical Jungian thought, of course, in terms of talking about the shadow. Without the shadow, there really is no ability to take the contents of the unconscious back over into consciousness. Stage of the depressive position that they've never been able to get through. They have been made to feel terribly guilty for their rage. And the tendency always is for the therapist to tend to act that out. If someone is feeling terribly guilty and they are into this kind of rage reaction, really, you will tend to react as a stern parent unless you watch yourself and process that reaction and interpret it. To, in other words, help their severe, punitive, sadistic superego give way a bit and allow that rage to come out. The rage is strongly split off, suppressed, repressed, every possible way, because that's how they were treated in childhood.
What about the rage that's brought out in therapy and then roams through the world seeking the destruction of everything in sight? There's no containment. I'm not real fond of all of these therapies that are so eager to put people in touch with their anger unless they have some container for it.
Yeah, you're right. That's right.
So, by acting out, ever come to terms, ever slow down, reflect.
No. Acting out is a terrible thing vis-a-vis this experience. It often leads to more problems than anything else. You see, your point is well taken. I don't want to add to your own anger about that. Clearly, therapy is a double-edged sword, and it can do as much harm or more than good, and a lot of people are better off never being in it. We know that. But, you see, the issue of acting out that you bring up, that's a serious issue, because on the one hand, acting out a lot of this anger and whatnot can be perhaps a necessary blowout valve. But generally, what acting out does is it blocks, inhibits the compensatory function of psyche. Do you understand that? When not everybody, and certainly not acting out characters and borderline personalities and preadable disorders and whatnot, have a functioning compensatory aspect to their psyche. They don't have an internal inhibition or even prohibition on their activities. So instead, they run loose. Now, Jung made a cardinal point at the compensatory function of the psyche as a way of thinking about dreams, as a way about thinking about the way the psyche works. But we have to understand that compensatory function itself can break down and cease to function. I'll give you an example. I have a patient who's a severe bulimic. Had been severe, a little less severe now. And so she is eating and vomiting much less than she had. Even starting to enforce what she calls health days, in which she eats healthy food and does not vomit. After one of these health days that she enforced, even at great stress, she dreamt that she went into a bathroom because she wanted to eat and vomit. She had eaten something and had gone to a dinner in a dream, and since she had eaten previously, she wanted to vomit so she could eat again. And so she went into a bathroom to vomit. And she went into all the different stalls, and they were all filled with vomit and shit and whatnot. And it was all so disgusting, there was no way to vomit. Now, what that awful situation represents, at least to me, is the psyche responding in terms of creating its compensatory function again. By virtue of not acting out, the compensatory function comes back, which will further inhibit the bulimic act. Whereas if one acts out, it in turn destroys the compensatory function. This is why acting out is such a problem, and this is why parameters of control are imposed by psychoanalytic therapists like Kernberg on the borderline patient. I don't think he doesn't think of it in those terms as far as I know, but to me it's the meaningful way to think about it, that the acting out, the abuse in that way blocks psyche's own natural inhibition. Yeah.
Can you go on from the issue of this rage, then how do we get from there to the child of joy, then if acting out isn't the way?
Yeah, well, you see, if one can have the emotions of Demeter, which are emotions of rage, emotions of depression, and one can embody those emotions like Demeter, be part of the somatic unconscious with them. And if one can go back a step, you see, back a crucial step to the so-called lesser mysteries of Aloysius. It's not sufficient to have just the emotions of Demeter to retrieve that child of joy, to retrieve the lost feminine self within, the chore. The Greeks said a woman is first a mother and then a maiden. For a woman to achieve her maidenhood, it's not sufficient to just have the greater mysteries of Aloysius. There were lesser mysteries. Now, in the lesser mysteries, which were modeled after Dionysian rites, the tale of the rape of Persephone was re-experienced. Now, you see, here's where again we meet the all-important spirit dimension. Because if you remember, Persephone's rape comes after she reaches for the giant Narcissus. When Narcissus dies, a little flower grows. But in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, what we learn about is that she reaches for a flower, which is not an ordinary flower, ordinary Narcissus, but a giant Narcissus, pleasing in smell and fragrance to humans and gods alike. What is happening here is the divine energy that was split off by the narcissistic character, okay? This transcendent energy that I spoke about earlier, that was split off by the narcissistic character's defense structures, is now coming back and showing itself after the death of Narcissus as this giant Narcissus. It's no small flower she picks. She picks a giant transcendent flower she's drawn to. See? There's where you get the luminosity returning. There's where you get it returning. Now what you also can recognize then is that, just to shift back to the narcissistic character, there's also a terrific loss of the feminine in that character disorder. As part of the need to defend against psychic rape, envy, intrusion, there's a splitting off of the feminine. And that one aspect of the feminine that's split off is Persephone, the unique soul that leads to embodied selfhood. Now there are other aspects of the feminine that are split off also, and I'm going to talk about that this in the lecture late afternoon. Another aspect is the Eros Psyche myth.
Clarify why Persephone is that you need so.
Yeah. That comes, if you wish, a mythological reason, that comes from the Pausanias myth of Narcissus. You see, what we're dealing with here are mythological intuitions that have lived for centuries that are helping us, like psychic x-rays, detect what's happening underneath the narcissistic character. If you were to listen to Kohut, for example, you would read that that when the idealized transference has sufficiently been integrated, and this is what he says in his second book, The Restoration of the Self, he says that can be a time where analysis is over, finished. And he says that sometimes a sign of that is the patient seems to fade away. To me, that's just exactly the entrance into what I've called the second stage of transformation. Because what's starting to manifest then, you see, is this Persephone-like soul, that which is taken by the Hades force and pulled into the underworld. Now, to say why is Persephone that part, well, it's that part from a mythological tradition, because Pausanias' story of the Narcissus myth is that Narcissus was looking desperately after his sister. And he says that he believes that the Narcissus, that this myth happened before the Narcissus flower. In other words, something happened, a split-off feminine. He says the death of the sister, a split-off feminine, and then he associates that sister with the Demeter-Kore myth. He associates the sister with Persephone. It's kind of a clumsy myth in a way. These two things are just pieced together. And he associates it to the sister, and the message is that it happened before the Narcissus tale. And that is because that tells us something of absolute important clinical relevance, that there is a strong splitting off of the feminine that happens as part of the eventual formation of the narcissistic character structure. And then after that structure transforms, we again move back towards the feminine realm. Okay? Now, how do we move back towards the feminine realm? It's not easy. And that comes up, we go to the Homeric hymn to Demeter. And at least ask ourselves how the ancient Greeks approached this. And their way was to re-experience, in the lesser mysteries of Aloysius, the ascent, the reaching for the divine flower by Persephone, and the rape experience by Hades, who is identified with Dionysus. Now that was a drug-induced experience. The Eleusinian mysteries were generally drug-induced in ways that are well beyond our understanding now. But the attempt was to get the person to ascend to a kind of light, upper experience, Zeus, light, Hades, Dionysus is the underworld Zeus, to get the person to ascend and then experience the rape, meaning experience the attack of death that pulls one down into the unconscious. That is the experience I talked to you about earlier yesterday, about when the god reaches, like Prajapati reaches does tapas, or when Ormuz reaches for the divine light, in turn they create death. And the gaping jaws of death come to attack. In other words, in reaching for light, chaos is created. In the child's initial light, coming into time and space, chaos is created. Chaos that Melanie Klein talks about as the paranoid schizoid position, for example. This creation of chaos, if it's not detoxified by the mother, as we talked about, becomes overwhelming and massive splitting happens. The Persephone-like soul never comes up out of the underworld. Okay? Stays down there, lives there, never comes up. With an insufficient passage to the depressive position, same thing happens. soul never sufficiently reintegrates. These myths tell something essential. They say that the way of integration has to do with connection first to the divine light, and then it's lost. Okay? Now, what I'd like to do is just take a short break, like 10 minutes or so, and then come back and talk to you about how one experiences that divine light in a patient, and the kind of countertransference reactions that happen that correspond to the rape experience. Because we're not in a position to have our patients necessarily ascend to a transcendent experience, but we still can feel this myth operate. And one other thing to note, if there has not been a substantial spirit in the person to begin with, a substantial contact with the vertical spiritual dimension, either through their own kind of whatever their numinosity might be in their life, or through a nice, strong, idealized transference that's been integrated. In other words, if there hasn't been some degree of verticality in the person to begin with, then it, according to this mythology, and according to my belief anyways, there's very little hope of integrating the split-off soul. And instead, one turns to modalities such as deep regression, etc., according to the object relations point of view. So let's take a little break and go back to it. So we want to go on. We have a little time left. In talking about the way that luminous child returns, the Persephone child, I've stressed the need for that ascent dimension to have existed in one form or another, and for the analyst person to be able to have the Demeter-like consciousness. Okay? The embodied somatic consciousness. Now, in that state, and after, mind you, a considerable amount of the exhibitionism, ecstasy, dimensions of ecstasy, ascent, transport, all these dimensions that existed within the lesser mysteries all help towards being able to contact that Persephone-like soul and the other deities that appeared at Eleusis, like Dionysus. Now, when the Persephone-like soul begins to appear with a patient, you can see it like the Eleusinian vision saw it. As far as we know of that vision, we know it was a vision that was not clear and bright. Those very patriarchal-oriented philosophers, mystics, like Socrates, did not like the Eleusinian vision. It was not clear enough. They rejected it. Socrates' wife, Diatoma, says to him, Socrates, the lesser mysteries may be for you, but you may not enter the greater mysteries of Eleusis. Socrates' wife, Diatoma, chastises him, telling him that he may reach the lesser mysteries, but not the greater mysteries of Eleusis. That kind of ascent predilection that only wants to go up does not gain the kind of vision, the lunar kind of vision, the vision through body somatic consciousness that is needed to perceive these parts in ourselves, in others, that can be integrated and take the nice mythology of Persephone as its focus. Now, when one can see in your imaginal consciousness, this child, one can actually imaginally see a child, something I've called a child of joy. You can see joy in the person. You can see they can be talking. Often what will happen is the person will be talking about how terrible everything is. And yet if you look, you see there's joy inside. And what's happening is, by telling you how terrible everything is, they're defending against the rape, the attack they expect, if their joy shows, if their numinous energy shows. There's a great mystery here. If there's too much attack, if there's too much psychic rape, then then things are in a terrible standstill. But by the same token, a person must be able to absorb the attack of the death force, the attack of psychic rape, and even the attack of others' envy, the attack of others', brutality. Must be able to absorb it and not be wiped out by it, you see, in order that their Persephone-like souls are redeemed. So there's a real mystery in that rape experience. But the rape has to be positive, and the rape is a rape that comes positively through the analyst's imaginal seeing. Because what you're doing by seeing in this way is going deeper than the patient would like you to. You are penetrating deeper than the patient wants you to. Dionysus was originally a god of vision. In Minoan Crete, which was his origin, it's the visionary nature of Dionysus that's emphasized. The ecstatic, dismembering, erotic nature is important, but primarily the visionary quality that is Dionysus is the positive raping quality, to use a term that doesn't fit very well. You have to penetrate in order to connect to this aspect of the patient. You can't wait for them to talk about it. They are not going to free associate about it. It is not going to be helpful to see it in dreams and amplify it with the story of Persephone. Yeah.
Does the effect depend on the analyst being the intuitive type? It must be done by him?
It has absolutely nothing to do with the type. I'm certainly not an intuitive. No.
How does this fit in with the incubation, raping? This is a sense of timing that you see this soul, rather than letting something incubate, safely?
No, they kind of, this is not an incubation experience.
I'm saying, how does that fit in? It doesn't fit in.
It's a different archetype. It's an Aesculapian archetype. It's an archetype that, a vision of the god, of the healing numinous power. It's not the same as a flaring up of the goddess. The visions of Lysis were seen with open eyes. The vision that, for example, the god appearing like in the Aesculapian mysteries happens in sleep. So one is dealing with different levels of redemption, different levels, different kinds of healing. When you are able to get through the screen the person puts up of depression, darkness, things are terrible, and are able to see the child of joy and pick it out and talk about it, what you also soon feel through projective identification is a tendency to attack. What is fed into you very often is an energy of a sadistic attacker. That would take the form of envying that energy, wanting to destroy it in some way. Now, the most significant way, however, that the sadistic attack is fed into the therapist that I know of is by inducing the therapist to not pay attention to the child of light. by inducing the therapist to instead get caught in the patient's depressive talk. That is to say, the sadistic attack tends to get acted out through the therapist's reluctance to put the energy into penetrating and seeing. Do you follow me? That's the way, the primary way that I'm aware of, the most difficult way and most common way that the expected sadistic attack manifests through the therapist's withdrawal or staying on too surface a level.
So that from inside the patient, the frame of mind, if there is that level of consciousness, could be, you're not going to see me, are you?
Right. Absolutely. You're not going to see me, and if you see me, you're going to reject me, you're going to abandon me. Absolutely. And so consequently, what appears in the person are two children. What I've called a child of joy and a masochistic or depressed child. And I think this exists etiologically too. I think in a personality, I think we're able to maintain that joy for a certain amount of time and then lose it inevitably. And I think it incarnates as kind of a depressed child, a child that has lost its joy. In any event, I've seen this a lot in phenomenology of patients' dreams and whatnot, so I've put this out as somewhat of a theoretical structure. I'm sure it's not adequate for everybody. You know, that theory never can be. Everyone needs to work on this. But I think one of the ways the phenomenology really appears is through these two children. The child, the depressed child in my experience, is often older than the child of joy. But when one can begin to get the person to connect to that child of joy, that is an absolute key element of regeneration and transformation of personality.
If you can't use dreams to make that connection, you say talking about their dreams won't help you. How do you let them know? How do you communicate that you experience this?
Yeah, you tell them. You see, therapists often have the greatest difficulty, just sharing their subjective, reactions. If you are rooted in the somatic unconscious, if you are rooted in a space in which you are really in a primary inductive field in which you are have a kind of merger and your perceptions are certainly connected in some way to the patient's process, you're not in a power space. You've sacrificed power, knowing, all to be in your body. And what comes up is a gift. In fact, it's a gift of Hermes. It's all a kind of hermetic consciousness that begins to appear, that comes and goes. It's a gift of the gods. One shares it easily with a patient. The patient can say, no, I don't feel that. Fine, I was wrong then, perhaps. We can have a dialogue about what's happening. You see, I can tell a patient, gee, I see how depressed you are, but I look inside you, and what I think I see is joy. I've never had a patient deny that, ever. Because if you're, not that I could, but if you really see at that level, there's no problem sharing that. Why not? Why not? The only reason one might say why not is one's intruding on the patient with one's own subjectivity, but it's not your own subjectivity. It's perhaps a subjectivity of the unconscious that one can risk. I mean, Hermes is a trickster, too. Leads one astray. Sometimes mistakes happen. Fine. Mistakes happen, more rage comes up. One deals with it, but doesn't take it so seriously. You're not the healer. These problems come from feeling we are too important in what we do. We don't do. Yeah.
Is this in any way related to what's feeling the sense of despair prior to this recognition of the childlike?
Well, very commonly, there can be a kind of despair in the therapist, and what you can do then is feel that despair. And what does it do to you? And you can find that if you let the despair be there, you kind of find yourself withdrawing from the patient. And if you listen to that and look at how your withdrawal is happening and sort of be able to play with it, you might see that that's sadistic. Look what I'm doing. And then you can pull yourself back around to see. But all, I think, has to be communicated. And you have to tell the patient, it seems to me, I feel, you expect me to withdraw, And often that kind of material can be fed back to the patient because very often when that's happening, what's going on is what's getting recapitulated in the therapy is that the patient's mother was depressed and the patient had sacrificed their life in order to heal the mother's psychotic depression. And then in therapy, this is frequently reenacted, where the mother's depression that the patient has introjected is reprojected out into the therapist, who then carries the depression, you see. And in turn, does not see the child's real energy, real light, as the mother did it, because that would threaten that the child could separate from the mother. Doesn't help the child, patient, have its power, in other words. So those kind of, transference, countertransference interactions are always important. And you have to tell the patient, it seems to me, I feel, you expect me to withdraw, And often that kind of material can be fed back to the patient because very often when that's happening, what's going on is what's getting recapitulated in the therapy is that the patient's mother was depressed and the patient had sacrificed their life in order to heal the mother's psychotic depression. And then in therapy, this is frequently reenacted, where the mother's depression that the patient has introjected is reprojected out into the therapist, who then carries the depression, you see. And in turn, does not see the child's real energy, real light, as the mother did it, because that would threaten that the child could separate from the mother. Doesn't help the child, patient, have its power, in other words. So those kind of, transference, countertransference interactions are always important and always have to be taken within their particular context and dealt with. So it's in this way, I think, that child of joy and this quality of the feminine self gets integrated. That means to say a chore becomes part of the woman or a man. And one way of thinking about that is both men and women have anima quality. Have a quality of the feminine which is interested in transformation, development, change, creativity. And when conjoined with the Demetrian somatic unconscious, gives a sense of uniqueness. Now, atelosis, many other divinities besides Persephone exist, principally Dionysus, meaning a kind of Dionysian consciousness, the penetrating consciousness, the imaginal consciousness, and a whole reemergence of eros and erotic life. Body consciousness, and the body as an erotic being comes with this. And there's also a rather strange god that comes along with it, named Triptolemus. And as you read in the mysteries, for example, in Karengi and Otto and whatnot, they always say that the mysteries could go on without Triptolemus. He is associated with a god as Ares, as a very unruly quality of Dionysus or of the war god Ares, who is then transformed and brings mankind grain, brings mankind grain, which is the civilizing force, helps mankind with agriculture. And in those mysteries, they wonder, the people that deal with it in their hermeneutics, they wonder, why need triptalamus? Well, that's something that I just leave you with and leave a few more minutes for questions, but it strikes me that one can think of this strange figure of triptalamus as corresponding to this very important concept in Adlerian psychology called social interest. In that, with the transformation on an internal level corresponding to the redemption of Persephone and the Dionysian consciousness, one also creates civilization, culture, through triptalamus. You see? And what that leads to is a sense of social usefulness. Social usefulness is an extremely important concept. To feel a need to be socially useful is a very mature thing.
That's the connection to the intrapsychic. That's the connection to the intrapsychic in theology and the anthropology and so forth. And so the culture and civilization, you're saying this is the connection.
To the intrapsychic, exactly. One does not have to achieve a kind of social interest through educating the patient as an Adlerian approach, although that can be very valid. But there is the same quality emerges from inner transformation. And when a person has a sense of social interest, social usefulness, they're serious people, you see. And they have a serious concern for what they do and how they communicate and what effect they have on people.
Can you tell us a little bit about this God and how that connects to social usefulness?
Well, I think one way that I'm interpreting this figure of triptalamus is as social usefulness because he's the one who brings culture. He's the culture God. He represents the transformation of the raw power principle in the god Ares. You see, and in Adlerians teach us that out of that far beyond power inferiority problems comes the more cardinal issue of social usefulness, which, by the way, has its analog in Jungian psychology as a outer face of anima development. The inner development of the feminine has an extroverted outer face in terms of the development of culture, something John Layard described in his paper, The Virgin Archetype. Yeah.
When Persephone comes back with Hecate and Athena, would Athena also be representative of that culture-giving goddess at this point? Is that a...
I don't know that. Maybe. I think she's mostly there as a war goddess, mostly there in that form. Right. It's quite, I hadn't thought of that, but that's an interesting thought. I won't be at all surprised. I think what's interesting to know is that these deep introverted processes do link back to culture. They do link back.
And this is what's been totally denied in a sense with certainly art of the 20th century.
Oh, there's some disagreements about that. I mean, that denied that it links back to culture. Oh, I see what you mean. That, of course. Oh, yes, exactly. Those critiques, even Ehrenstein's critiques. Absolutely. Yes.
Also the link positively to a woman's re-entering the outer world in a transformed way.
Oh, I think it must make a big role there, where she begins to carry the quality of wisdom. Where she carries wisdom as real feminine wisdom, feminine power and wisdom, in a cultural, meaningful way, Well, I would say that male wisdom often has more to do with consciousness and has more to do with logos, more to do with the important spirit, less to do with the just so reality of deep wisdom of nature that knows, for example, that such and such is wrong, not good, won't lead to positive results. That deep instinctual level that I think a woman is often much better connected to than a man. Now, have to be ending. We talked about the Persephone myth. If any of you are interested for the afternoon, I'm going to do my best to talk about Eros Psyche myth, which is another redemption of the feminine. That's another aspect of the feminine that's split off by narcissistic structuring of the psyche. And that's the redemption through love. So we'll have to close now, and thank you very much.